Hello and good evening all. We come now to our penultimate episode in our Porsche Prototype story, looking at the 908. The 909 won't get its own episode because it really only existed for a very brief period of time, and I talked about it in a previous video. After this video, I'm going to take an extra week or two to script the 917 video, as it'll likely be a touch longer than these that have preceded it. So next week, it'll be another theme week, in the same vein as Oddity Week last year, although we'll see if I ruffle as many feathers as I did with the video about that horrible Colani Le Mans prototype that cost us a Lamborghini Miura, and of course, never ran at Le Mans or ever went in the same vague direction of a racetrack. Also, as an apology, we are continuing with the mixed photos strategy that I used last week, because while I do have a couple of my own photos of the 908, it's very much a couple of them, and thus not really sufficient to make a whole video. At the same time, if those of you who have actually watched a good number of my videos don't mind the use of the Assetto Corsa type footage as background with regular photos interspersed in between, let me know, because it would save me a bucket load of time in actually making these videos, and if it doesn't diminish the enjoyment that you, dear viewers, get, then job's a good one for everybody. Anyway, on to the video. The 907 represented, in many ways, the acme of its design's capabilities. The chassis was excellent, but the 8-cylinder engine that had powered the factory cars for some time was still derived from the same fundamental architecture that had originally been intended for Formula One at the beginning of the decade. It had continued to be unreliable, and at 2.2 liters was at its maximum displacement for the block. With the introduction of the 1968 rules that now limited prototypes to 3 liters, Porsche decided to build a new engine that made full use of the full displacement allowance in furtherance of Ferdinand Piëch's desire for outright victory at Le Mans and in the World Sports Car Championship. Herr Metzger, our engine designer for this story, began work on the new engine by modifying the block from the quad-cam racing version of the 911's 6-cylinder, adding 2 additional cylinders, and resulting in the Type 908 engine. As usual, not too original with the names. Displacing the desired 3 liters, it made about 320 horsepower at 8,400 RPM, about 50 more than the best achieved by the old Type 771 flat-8 power plant, with particularly well-built examples reportedly capable of up to 370. All of this also came with greatly improved reliability over the old 771. The 2-frame chassis was largely carried over from the previous cars, now pressurized with pressure gauges to help determine if any damage occurred during a race, this time utilizing a more robust iteration of the aluminum version originally designed for the hill-climbing Bergspiders. We still had fiberglass bodywork, sometimes thin enough you could shine a flashlight through it, and vehicle weight varied based on the bodywork employed, with the later Spider models, the 908/02s and 03s, generally coming in around 550 kilos, or 1,212 pounds, and the Coupe 908/01s about 100 kilos, or 220 pounds heavier. The 908/01s were fundamentally unchanged from the 907s in terms of styling, with both short and long-tailed versions available, just as with the 907. The only actual changes were slightly different air intakes at the front and the addition of semi-active aero linked to the rear suspension. This would later be disallowed in 1969 on the 908s, but allowed on the 917s, as they had been designed with the feature while it had been a later addition to the 908. As mentioned in last week's video, the 908 made its debut as the new top Porsche racer at Le Mans Test Day in 1968, where its aerodynamic foibles from the long-tail body were found to still be present after the 907's issues the previous year. Surprise, surprise. Only the barest of development work was taken to rectify this in the months between the car's debut and the eventual running at Le Mans, prolonged because of strikes, and this allowed the smaller engine of the Ford GT40s that remained eligible for the championship to catch up in the points standings, such that going into Le Mans, now the season closer, Porsche and Ferrari, good lord, listen to me, Porsche and Ford were tied for the manufacturer's title. The 908s did show up at La Sarthe that year with a rear spoiler, but remained reportedly floaty at speeds above 160 or so. The cars did take pole position and set the race's fastest lap, but the driving difficulties, along with a raft of mechanical issues and some rules infractions throughout the race, as well as a strong pace from the Fords, meant that the best 908 finished only third overall that year, behind one of the John Wyer-run GT40s and a Privateer 907. While a non-championship race at Paris in October did grant the car its first win to close out its debut year, with hill climb experts Hans Hermann and Rolf Stommelen standing atop the podium ahead of Vic Elford and Rudy Linz in another 908, a more substantial raft of upgrades were devised in the off-season. Also coming in the off-season was an adjustment to the production quantities required for the exemption from the 3-liter displacement cap for prototypes, reduced from 50 cars to 25 after the FIA received concerns, shall we say, from sponsors and manufacturers that the 50-car requirement was creating insufficient interest, shall we say. This fundamentally changed the economics of building a car specifically to take advantage of this exemption, and Porsche pivoted their focus from the 908 to building a new 5-liter car, intended to replace the 908 as Porsche's primary model for long, high-speed tracks, while the 908 would be retained in modified form to contest the races that demanded maneuverability, like the Targa Florio and the various hill climbs that Porsche had dominated with little exception since the late 50s. The start of the 1969 season seemed to reinforce the need for this shift. While in 1968, Porsche had taken a photo finish 1-2-3 victory with the 907L at the Daytona 24-hour race, the 1969 race has been described variously as a fiasco, debacle, disaster, and complete failure. Despite modifications to improve airflow and cooling for the car going into the season, all 5 908s that the factory entered that year retired with mechanical issues, and really the race didn't go well for any of the anticipated frontrunners. The returning season champion Ford GT40s under John Wyer's aegis both retired with cracked cylinder heads. Ferrari were still sitting things out with teething issues for their new 312P, and nobody else, like the Alphas or Matras, were really expected to have the speed or durability to compete with those at the top of the field, thus leaving a Penske-entered Lola T70 Mark IIIB, yes, the one with the extra headlamps concealing torpedo tubes for attacking merchant convoys, to carry the day, despite issues with their fueling system that meant that they had to pit twice as frequently as intended, and Chuck Parsons as a co-driver, who, at the time, lacked any experience racing at Daytona or at night, which, in midwinter at Daytona, does take up a not insignificant portion of the race time. It was the only and final major international victory for a T70, but quite a fitting one in its way, as it gave Penske a huge boost as a team on the international stage, and to the reputation they enjoyed to this day. Nevertheless, Porsche bounced back with victories for the 908 at Monza and Spa that spring, revealing the 917 in the lead up to Le Mans, and sending 7 factory cars, a mix of 917s and 908s, including a 908 Spider, to lead a 16-strong Porsche Prototype contingent. Though the 917s were fastest in practice, put themselves on pole, and broke the lap record set by the Ford GT40 Mark IV in 1967, which Ford was actually so intent on keeping they had contrived to get the track redesigned just to defend it, adding the Ford chicane, the race again did not go Porsche's way. The 908s of Joe Siffert and Rudy Linz had locked out the second row of the grid, not that they really did rows in that era, followed by the new Ferraris, which were finally ready for their debut. The Fords were well down the order in the mid-teens qualifying. The Penske Lola had been expected to show up, but didn't after it was stolen, stripped for parts, and left destroyed shortly after that year's 12 Hours of Sebring, which is really quite unfortunate. The race itself is widely considered to have been one of the most hotly contested and exciting editions of the race's 100-year history, and will get its own video in the not terribly distant future. The last year of the traditional Le Mans start, it saw Jackie Ickx's iconic protest, and the second year in a row for a first-lap accident caused by the start, this year John Wolfe losing control on the approach to Maison Blanche in his new 917. This a privateer entry for which he paid, I think, $14,000, with the car hitting an embankment and exploding, with Wolfe dead before he reached hospital. This also caused the retirement of Chris Amon's Ferrari 312, although Amon was unharmed in the ensuing fire. The 917s eventually all succumbed to various issues, with the last of them retiring at the 22nd hour with gearbox issues, 10 laps after the penultimate 908 did the same. This left only one Porsche prototype in the hunt for the win, one of the factory 908s driven by Hans Hermann and Gerhard Larousse, pitted against Jackie X in the number 6 John Wyer GT40, now leading after his start from the back of the grid following his protest walk. Both cars were struggling with mechanical issues, but remained evenly matched, swapping the lead at least 10 times during the final stint. But when the checkered flag flew, it was the GT40 ahead of the 908 across the line by less than a mere 50 meters. In fact, it was the same chassis that had won the year prior. Porsche did manage to win the championship for makes that year, buoyed by additional victories for the 908 in various forms at Brands Hatch, Matoni, The Ring, and Watkins Glen, as well as an inaugural victory for the 917 at the Oostenrijkring, but Lessard had eluded the team yet again. Almost all of the victories for the 908 that year actually came from open-topped versions of the car, the 908K Spiders. While some were converted from 908/01s and generally featured flatter bodies, the Flunder Spiders, most of the 908/02s built had a slightly more aesthetically pleasing styled body with a bit of a curve at the wheel and a more lifted tail. Without the extra fiberglass of a roof and the long tail, these cars were the better part of 100 kilos lighter, as previously mentioned. They also served as a testbed for Porsche's first attempt at implementing ABS, but this was not retained for competition use. Hey, Steve McQueen even raced one. The 908/02 went 1-2-3 at the aforementioned Brands Hatch race, 1-2-3-4 at the Targa Florio, and led the way to a staggering 1-2-3-4-5 at the 1,000 kilometers of Nurburgring that year, Porsche's third repeat victory at the event. But the company's focus was increasingly shifting towards development of the 917 and its flat 12, leaving less time and fewer resources for the 908. Nevertheless, for the next year, they did go on to develop a final 908/03 model, using a redesigned aluminum and titanium tube frame based on that of the 909, and adjusting the mechanicals to improve weight distribution. This model's sole purpose was to support the 917 and bring Porsche victory at the two relatively low-speed races in the calendar, the Targa Florio and the Nurburgring, debuting at the former race in 1970. Perfectly fitted for its purpose, Joe Siffert and Brian Redman took yet another victory in Sicily for Porsche, following that up with a win at the Ring the same year, driven by Jorth Arends and Vic Elford. Redman was unfortunately unable to repeat his success at the Targa Florio in 71, when on the first lap he crashed after the car's steering broke and he hit a wall. Suffering extensive second-degree burns, it took more than 3/4 of an hour before medical help arrived, with spectators providing assistance in the interim. Eventual victory went to one of the 3-liter Alfa Romeo prototypes that had debuted in 1969, driven by Nino Vaccarella and Toine Hezemans, one of the few high points of the car's career. Though the 917 star was established and rising further still by this point, the 908 remained remarkably popular in various forms for a considerable length of time in private hands, as they were sold off in 1970 and 71, after Porsche's focus turned entirely to the 917, with cars competing in the World Sports Car Championship until 1981, and in inter-series competition until 1982, with the 8-cylinder power plant replaced in later years by a turbocharged flat 6 that produced about 60% more power than the naturally aspirated flat 8, usually at great expense to the car's looks. Reinhold Jost's success as a team owner in sports cars was largely built on the 908 in his early years, running with moderate successes in class throughout much of the 70s before he made the step up to Group C in the subsequent decade. But of course, all of this was effectively overshadowed in the annals of racing history by the car's big brother, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. 908s are nevertheless very expensive, as with their other Porsche prototype stablemates, And as with most of those between the 904 and 917, nobody seems to make replicas of them. I have found some reports of 906 replicas being made in Argentina, but that's about it. It does seem like spiders would really be rather simple from a fiberglass work perspective, and as long as you've got somebody that's good at TIG welding and a ready supply of air-cooled 901 power plants, there's a business idea for the entrepreneurial among you. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube:
like, comment, subscribe.
Today, July 26th, is the effective birthday of the U.S. Postal Service. So, in celebration, go ahead and lose something valuable to someone else, run enormous deficits, and cheat at cycling. That just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all a good night and a good tomorrow.